Money behaves differently once it crosses certain thresholds, and one of the most quietly discussed but widely observed turning points sits around $100,000. This number appears repeatedly in financial literature, economic studies, and long-term wealth research not because it guarantees financial security, but because it represents a structural shift in how money begins to interact with time. To understand why this threshold changes behavior, imagine two individuals starting their financial lives at very different points on the same mathematical curve, both moving forward through the same economic environment, both exposed to the same markets, inflation pressures, and cost of living structures, yet experiencing money in fundamentally different ways simply because of the amount of capital already in motion. For someone with only a few $100s saved, money behaves almost entirely as a tool for stability. It exists to absorb unexpected expenses, bridge gaps between paychecks, or prevent short-term disruptions from becoming long-term problems. The psychological weight attached to each dollar becomes significant because every dollar has a specific purpose, often already assigned before it even arrives. When an unexpected expense appears, the system becomes fragile. A medical bill, a car repair, or a temporary loss of income forces money to move backwards rather than forward, and the person spends most of their financial energy maintaining balance rather than building momentum. Now contrast that with the experience of someone whose savings have gradually reached six figures. The day this number appears in an account statement does not instantly transform a person's financial reality, yet something subtle changes inside the structure of their money. At that scale, capital begins to interact with time in a way that is less dependent on constant manual effort. Instead of every dollar being immediately consumed by the present, a portion of money can remain stationary long enough to participate in long-term economic growth mechanisms such as market appreciation, interest accumulation, or asset ownership. This is where the mathematical behavior begins to shift. The core principle behind the 100,000 threshold is not psychological motivation or discipline alone, but the simple arithmetic of compounding. When capital is small, compounding is technically present but practically invisible. A few dollars of growth over an entire year does not feel like momentum. Feels like stagnation. The human brain struggles to stay patient when the numbers move slowly, which is why early saving stages often feel disproportionately difficult relative to later stages. Once the base amount becomes larger, the same percentage change produces noticeably larger results. A 5% annual growth rate applied to $1,000 produces $50 over a year. The same 5% applied to $100,000 produces $5,000. The rules have not changed, the discipline required has not changed, and the underlying economic mechanism has not changed. Yet the visible outcome now begins to resemble progress in a way that the human mind can recognize. This moment does not represent financial freedom, nor does it remove risk or uncertainty, but it changes the relationship between effort and outcome. Prior to this stage, financial progress depends heavily on continuous contribution. After this stage, existing capital begins contributing alongside the individual. The system now contains two engines instead of one. New income entering the system and existing capital slowly multiplying within it. From a behavioral economics perspective, this shift also affects decision-making patterns. When people feel that their financial system has no momentum, they tend to focus almost entirely on short-term stability. Spending decisions revolve around immediate needs, short planning horizons, and protection against near-term uncertainty. Long-term investing often feels abstract or distant because the perceived impact appears small. Once the base amount grows large enough for compounding to become visible, the psychological framework changes. People begin thinking in longer time horizons because they can see that time itself has measurable value. Instead of asking how much money can be saved this month, the question gradually shifts toward how long money can remain invested without interruption. The focus moves from controlling every dollar to protecting the conditions that allow compounding to continue. Historical financial data reinforces this observation repeatedly. Across multiple decades of market cycles, individuals who reach a moderate capital base often experience an acceleration phase where the combination of consistent contributions and compounding growth produces results faster than earlier stages would suggest. Importantly, this does not mean the system suddenly becomes easy. Market volatility still exists, economic recessions still occur, and personal circumstances can always interrupt the process. What changes is simply the scale at which time interacts with capital. This resilience reduces stress inside the financial decision-making process. When people are constantly operating near the edge of their financial capacity, each decision carries significant emotional pressure. The brain shifts into risk avoidance mode, prioritizing safety over optimization. With a larger capital buffer, decisions can be evaluated with slightly more distance, allowing longer-term reasoning to play a greater role. Economists sometimes describe this stage as a transition from survival finance to structural finance. In survival finance, money flows through the system quickly, entering and exiting within short time cycles. In structural finance, a portion of money remains in place long enough to participate in larger economic systems such as equities, real estate, or long-term financial instruments. The difference is not intelligence or discipline alone, but time availability. Capital must remain stationary long enough for larger systems to influence it. This concept also explains why the early stages of wealth building often feel disproportionately difficult compared to later stages. During the first phase, individuals are attempting to construct a system that can support compounding before compounding has enough capital to demonstrate its effect. It is similar to pushing a heavy flywheel that initially resists movement. The early pushes require significant effort, yet visible motion remains minimal. Once momentum begins building, the same pushes create larger rotations because the system is already in motion. Importantly, the 100,000 number should not be interpreted as a universal rule or a guaranteed turning point. Economic environments differ, investment returns vary across decades, and personal financial structures influence how quickly compounding becomes visible. The threshold functions more as a symbolic representation of scale rather than a strict boundary where financial behavior suddenly transforms.
Behind the thick trunk of a tree, two soldiers stood frozen, barely breathing. Smoke curled through the forest ahead. The gunfire had stopped minutes ago, but the sharp scent of gunpowder still hung in the air. The soldier in front, his eyes wide with fear, whispered, "Did you hear that?" The one behind him tightened his grip on his rifle. "Yeah, but that wasn't a gunshot." A sudden rustling came from the bushes. Both of their hearts pounded violently. The front soldier pressed himself harder against the tree, his mind flashing with images of home, his mother's prayers, his little brother's laughter, the promise he had made to return safely. The rustling grew louder. A shadow moved. They exchanged a quick glance. "Ready?" the second soldier murmured. The bushes shook. And then, a small injured dog stumbled out, trembling and whimpering. Silence. The front soldier let out a shaky breath, his eyes softening. "We're not fighting the enemy right now, we're fighting our fear." The second soldier slowly lowered his weapon. "Maybe that's the real battle." The smoke slowly began to fade. The war wasn't over, but in that moment, they understood something important. Sometimes courage isn't about pulling the trigger. Sometimes it's about lowering the gun. Behind the thick trunk of a tree, two soldiers stood frozen, barely breathing. Smoke curled through the forest ahead. The gunfire had stopped minutes ago, but the sharp scent of gunpowder still hung in the air. The soldier in front, his eyes wide with fear, whispered, "Did you hear that?" The one behind him tightened his grip on his rifle. "Yeah, but that wasn't a gunshot." A sudden rustling came from the bushes. Both of their hearts pounded violently. The front soldier pressed himself harder against the tree, his mind flashing with images of home, his mother's prayers, his little brother's laughter, the promise he had made to return safely. The rustling grew louder. A shadow moved. They exchanged a quick glance. "Ready?" the second soldier murmured. The bushes shook. And then, a small injured dog stumbled out, trembling and whimpering. Silence. The front soldier let out a shaky breath, his eyes softening. "We're not fighting the enemy right now, we're fighting our fear." The second soldier slowly lowered his weapon. "Maybe that's the real battle." The smoke slowly began to fade. The war wasn't over, but in that moment they understood something important. Sometimes courage isn't about pulling the trigger. Sometimes it's about lowering the gun.